Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Chiana and I'm a hobby artist. Let's paint agate slices today. Maybe you want to try a new set of paint, or maybe you have artist block. This is a nice, easy exercise to do when you want to play with watercolor. Here are a few pieces from my crystal collection that I will use for inspiration for my painting. You can see they are mostly deep earth tones with really pretty geometric type centers. I'm going to keep my stash of watercolor brushes available. They are mostly a mix of the Mimik Squirrel brushes from Jerry's Autorama and the Escoda Versatile Synthetic Kolinsky brushes. I have 2 jars of water, one for brush cleaning and one for painting. I dab my brushes on this towel to help get out excess paint and control the amount of water on my brush. These are my Derwent Graphitint watercolors. They are fairly muted pigments that I thought would work well with the earth tones of the agates. I haven't used them much, so this is a perfect time to try them out. I think I may want to also try a different, more colorful palette, since we are just experimenting anyway. This purple agate is very vibrant, so let's use my Kuretake Gansai Tambi paints. This is the set of 48 colors. The packaging is absolutely gorgeous. I've used it a few times. I love how pigmented these paints are. I think I'll pull out a few blues, greens, and purples from the palette, and we can use the metallic colors here at the end for accents. I'm going to be painting in my Canson Montval watercolor sketchbook. These can be pretty inexpensive when you find them on sale, so I use one almost like a scrap palette to play with color before painting it on my actual painting. And here's the one I'm going to be doing my drawing in. We have salt in a little salt bowl to help us make our crystal centers. I want to try plastic wrap to see if that will make crystal centers as well. So here I sped up the recording a little bit because for this part I'm just doing a quick sketch. When you're drawing a natural object like an agate slice, there's so much variation in nature. You don't have to worry if it's not perfect in your sketchbook. This is just for fun anyway, just to play around. So as you're doing this, relax and have fun. I'm just throwing down some light guidelines just so I have an idea of where I want my paint to go. I'm making a few little adjustments. And then once I do that, I go over it with my kneadable eraser to lighten the lines so that once I put paint over it, you can't really see the lines in the final piece. We're going to start with the center of this agate over here. And again, the recording is sped up a bit. We're going to start with the Derwent Graphitint paints. We're putting down a layer of water to make the paint kind of bleed a bit. And the first color we're going to use is the graphite gray. It's going to look like it goes on pretty dark. But once we sprinkle the salt over it, and it dries, it's going to be much lighter. So it's okay to be a bit heavy-handed over here. I threw in a little bit of slate green too, just to give it a bit of a layered look. Okay, so now that the paint is down, I'm going to put a pretty thick layer of salt over the wet paint. This is kosher salt, but it's kind of fine. I'm not sure how the crystals are going to look once I take it off, but it's okay if it's not perfect. Now we're going to use the Kuretake in the following colors: forest green, turquoise green deep, horizon blue, cobalt violet, ultramarine, blue-gray deep. We'll do burnt sienna up here with the greens and blues, and then we'll do some yellow ochre with the blues and purples. I feel like they're kind of opposite on the color wheel, so I think it'll work out pretty well. So I'm looking at my agate just to get an idea of what I want to do. I'm going to put down a nice thick layer of water to make sure the paint blends. The first color I'm going to throw in is the horizon blue, and I'm just throwing it in there. I'm not really thinking too much about it. And then once I have a little bit of that in, I'm going to throw in the blue-gray deep. And I'm scattering it in. And I know, again, the salt is going to lighten it quite a bit, so I want to make sure I've got a lot of paint there. And here goes the salt. And you want to make sure the salt is super, super, super dry before you scrape it off. Now I'm going to do the purple agate. And for this one, I'm not going to use the salt. I'm going to use a little piece of plastic wrap. I want to see if I get a difference in the type of crystal structure. I'm just pressing it in. And now we're going to wait for it to dry. So here I am removing the plastic wrap. And I kind of like the way that came out. So after letting it sit overnight, I scraped the salt off. And the crystal structures here are much smaller than under the plastic wrap. I actually think I like the plastic wrap a little bit better. So here's the agate we're going to paint first. Again, I'm just using it as a reference. This agate has more rings than blotches, so I think that's what I'm going to do here. Now the Graphitint paints I'm going to use are the russet, the autumn brown, and the steel blue. And I'm just going to do some rings around the salted area and in the center. There's something to keep in mind when you use salts in your paintings. It may not be quite as archival, which in this case it doesn't bother me anyway because it's in a sketchbook. And again, this is just for fun and just to see how these paints flow. This is only my second time using the Graphitint paints. And they do feel slightly different than watercolor. The graphite in them makes them a little bit more grainy, but they flow really well, which is nice. So here I'm just going around and around, making different laps of color. I'm trying to let them bleed together a little bit so I don't have harsh lines. Right here is the steel gray, or steel blue rather. And then I'm going to add in the autumn brown. And it's unusual for me to use colors that aren't very vibrant. So I feel like this looks a little bit dull, but I know it's just the types of paint I'm using. And I think in the long run, it'll make this look a little bit more realistic. And I'm not being careful at all as I'm going around the perimeter of this. It's okay if it's jagged. And I'm adding a little bit water to make the colors flow. And I just touched the center to see how dry it was. And it was very dry. You have to be careful when you're layering watercolor paints. If you put wet paint on slightly damp paint, you can make it lift. And I don't want to lift the paints. I want to layer the paints. over here, I'm doing another layer of water over the paints just to make them blend a little bit better. The lines are a little bit harsh, so I wanted to make sure that I had enough water to keep them blended. Now, right now, if you listen carefully, you might hear my dog snoring. She's lying next to me as I'm doing this recording. Ooh, she's noisy. Okay, so I'm doing another ring of the steel blue. And every time you see the brush going off camera, it's either getting dipped in the water or I'm dipping it onto my towel to take off extra water. I like using the towel instead of paper towel. I feel like it's a little bit more environmentally friendly. I can use my fabric towel dozens and dozens of times before I need to wash it. I feel like I would use a whole roll of paper towel doing 1 or 2 paintings. So the next thing I'm going to do before I let this dry is I'm going to load my brush up with very concentrated pigment from the steel blue. And I'm going to do a very, very thin edge around the slice of agate to simulate the crusty outside rock. And then I'm going to take some water, and on the inside of that line, I'm going to let the water kind of pull the pigment in, and it's going to give it like a natural kind of movement to the rock. Okay, so now we're going to work on this geode. And this one has more of a blobby kind of consistency. It's less stripy than the other one. So all I'm going to do is do a thick layer of water, and I'm going to just start dropping in color. I'm going to drop in the forest green, the turquoise green deep, and the burnt sienna. And I'm not going to worry about what this paint does. I'm just going to let it do its thing. This is the beauty about watercolor. It flows, it has a mind of its own, and sometimes the best thing you can do is to just let it go. So I'm continuing to put in color. The only thing I'm trying to pay attention to is to make sure that the color's fairly balanced. So if I see a spot that has a lot of blue and green, I'm going to throw in the sienna. And if I see a spot that has a lot of sienna, I'm going to throw in a blue or a green. And I really like the way the Kuretake paints just kind of marble and flow into each other. Not all watercolor, I feel, does this, but the Kuretake must have a binder in it that makes it super slippery and flowy. Okay, so we're going to move this slice of agate aside, and we're going to start on the purple one. What we're going to do is a thin layer of water around the center of the agate. And then we're going to drop some purple color into that to try to mimic the dark band that you see around the center. So over here, I found I was struggling getting the purple to be as deep as I wanted it to get. It's kind of surprising because if you look in the pan, it looks almost black. So I know it has the potential to get really dark. But I think I put too much water originally. So that's just something to keep in mind for the next time when I want to use this purple and I want it really deep, not to water it down too much. And again, this is a perfect example of why this is a great exercise to do with some new paints in your sketchbook. You really get to feel what the colors are like and how they behave. So now that this agate is dry, I'm going in and I'm doing another layer of the steel blue. I just want this to have a little bit more depth. And I'm going in with the russet again. I'm taking the russet and I'm doing a hard edge in between where the russet ends and the crystal section begins. It'll show a little bit more delineation between the two pieces. It's what I see when I look at my example, so I think it helps make it give a more realistic appearance. So now I'm going to focus on the white remaining section of this agate. I'm going to use the same approach that I did for the outer edge. I'm going to do a wash of water. And I'm going to use the two greens again, but this time I'm going to use a little bit of the yellow ochre in addition to the burnt sienna. You can see a very pure yellow ochre in the example piece. So that's the look I'm trying to go for. I found the Kuretake yellow ochre was a little bit harsh, a little bit vibrant, which normally I like, but in this particular circumstance, I think it was a little bit too mustard looking compared to the example piece. So I ended up dabbing a little bit of the burnt sienna in there to tone it down, and I think it helped. So now I'm going to do a very light layer of purple around the darker band of purple that I have. Again, using my agate slice as a reference. And this is quick. I'm just going right around the edge. And I'm going to need to let it dry before I start dabbing in the blues and purples. And over here, we're going to put a wash of water and drop in some gray and some ultramarine blue. And that looks pretty good against that green crystally center. And we're going to do the same process for the purple agate, but this time we're going to use the ultramarine with some purple. And I'm using a little bit less water here because I remembered from earlier that the purple isn't quite as strong as I would like, and I want to make sure it's nice and deep and dark over here. So something I haven't mentioned, in between each of these steps, I'm letting the paper dry to prevent each section from bleeding into the next section. And to help speed along the process, I'm using my hair dryer off camera. It definitely helps speed it along. Right now the air in New England is pretty humid. We've had a pretty warm October. So if I wasn't using the hair dryer, this would take hours and hours. And quite frankly, when I'm trying to do something like this, I want it to go pretty quick. If you're in a humid climate and you're doing this step with the salt, you're really going to want to make sure you use something to help the drying process. If you don't want to use a hairdryer, maybe have a fan running over the paper because the salt will keep pulling the moisture from the air and it actually won't dry at all. So you want to make sure you help the process along. Otherwise, you're going to want to use the saran wrap to get the crystal structure in the center of your agates. And over here, I'm just doing a slightly darker edge to delineate the crystals from the colored part of the agate. It shows a little bit more dimension when you do this. I'm trying something slightly different in this section. I'm going to do a water wash like I did earlier, but to create more of a marbled effect, I'm going to use the dark gray just around the edge, and I'm going to let it bleed into the water to create veins of the rock. And I like how that came out, so I'm going to do the same thing around the purple. But I want it a little bit darker and a little bit thinner over here. So now over here, I noticed that I don't feel like this crystal structure is very strong. So I'm going to do a little experiment again, and I'm going to put some water wash and some more gray into the water wash, and then I'm going to put saran wrap over it and see if I can get a double layer. So I'll have the green crystals with the gray crystals over it. So I like how the crystal structure looks around the edge. Now I'm going to just do a little bit more banding with the gray to create a few layers. So now we're going to add some gold accents to this first agate. And I think they're going to show up really well against the blue steel color. And I'm just using a light touch right around the edge. I'm not worrying about, what line that I follow. I'm just doing a light squiggle. And I think it makes it look almost a little bit more realistic by throwing in this shiny glitter. It reminds me of some mica that you might see in some stones. And we're going to add some silver to the purple agate. And that definitely complements the cool tones of the blues and the purples. And I'm just moving really quickly along the edge in the lighter colors of the agate. And we'll add a little touch of the silver to this one as well. Well, you can see this, the light hits this a little bit better, so you can hopefully see some of the glitter. So now we're going to use this coppery color for the last agate. And we're just going to load up the brush and use the fine point. And very, very loosely, like barely touching the paper, just draw a ring around this. And I think the copper colors really look good with the green and the turquoise. They really complement each other. And we're just about done. I just want to use some water and clean up and lift the little bit of smudge over here. And that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know if you try this out.